So can we invite further questions or from the audience? And we're still wielding the mics. Sorry, up in the balcony. I'm not, yeah. I doubt you need it, but go ahead.
All right, yeah, I've yelled in here before. Yeah, I am using the mic. Yeah. Yes. My question, I don't know who it's for. It follows Zephyr's focus, but I don't know who to direct it to. But is the political duopoly of Republicans and Democrats a threat to democratic capacity? And is it part of the gerrymandering problem? Is it part of the hacking and influence problem? Is it a threat to deliberation? I am left with that as my summary question from the morning, and I'd really like some input.
Zephyr, Zephyr, why don't you start first with that? Duopoly is close to monopoly, so.
I do think, I mean, there are extraordinary advantages and disadvantages to multi-party versus two-party systems. I think the great threat we have now has less to do with the fact of two parties and more to do with the fact of what those parties are, the ways in which those parties are increasingly organizations, because of our Supreme Court in large part, organizations that are, in political science we talk about party in electorate, versus party in government, and then the bureaucracy itself. They're increasingly non-representative, non-engaging. That actually goes back to 80s TV advertising, where you treat party members as consumers as opposed to actively involved. So I myself am actually not as skeptical about the two-party system. I'm skeptical about the way in which money and advertising has reshaped the relationship between the entity of the parties and the public which they represent, which has made them far less flexible and far less representative.
But maybe one way to pick up on this, just think about an event we had at Stanford with Patrick Adele and Mark Penn, two presidential pollsters, and I think I'm not quite sure where Teresa will come in this, but everybody else, should have an opinion. Do you feel the common perception, or let's say the common resentment of the political class is such, the belief that Washington, the national political establishment, has become a self-insulated mechanism, has to play into our perceptions of how well the democracy is operating? Their argument was there was, go beyond. Actually, really, all the issues Kathleen talked about, go past those, a deep dissatisfaction embedded in public opinion against the ruling political elite. Maybe each of us has some sense about.
I'll just say briefly, in my district, that was absolutely true. A lot of Trump voters just wanted something to change.
Mm-hmm. Jim?
In my book, I argue that we need. Well, no, just to set it up. We need choice, and we need deliberation. Some of you may be old enough to remember the time in the 1950s when the two parties were thought to be nearly identical, Tweedledum and Tweedledee, and early in that period, the American Political Science Association offered this report toward a more responsible two-party system, where they said we had to differentiate the parties so the parties would offer distinct programs to give the people a choice. And boy, we got what they wished for. But then the other side of it is you need deliberation and choice, deliberation by someone. And the parties are getting better and better at stifling, the parties and the other political actors are getting better and better at stifling public deliberation and even elite deliberation with party discipline. It used to be said that we had a candidate-centered process and there was little party discipline in the Congress. Now look at how much party discipline we have and how much polarization. So the people don't have a choice and the representatives don't get to deliberate. And as for a two-party system, look at Britain now with the issue of the ages, the Brexit issue, and the two parties not offering the people a choice. That is, you've got the Labor has now moved just towards the currency union, but not the single market. And the Conservatives are saying Brexit at all costs, a hard Brexit. And so the public doesn't have a choice. And so, and there was Russian manipulation in that one too. So we need to get a system where you can have deliberation and choice together, and that's the idea of the reforms that I'm arguing for.
Nick, Kathleen, do you have thoughts on this?
My concern is different. It is that there are problems facing the country, and in our current structure, we're not finding ways to address them. So it was the Republicans who came up with cap and trade. The Democrats come on board to cap and trade as a means of dealing with carbon in the atmosphere, and then suddenly the Republicans decide they can't favor cap and trade. Meantime, we've done nothing about the issue. And so, I mean, to the extent that whatever is going on is making it impossible for us to address issues that we need to address now, because the consequences of not doing it are consequences that are not socially acceptable. We need to worry about something that is deeply wrong, not simply in the party structure, but in the entire way in which this dialogue of democracy is occurring across all of our institutions.
Sorry, go ahead, Ruth.
Yeah, I think that my perspective is slightly different, but I mean, I share this concern, but the concern comes from, in my work on civility, I talk about how civility is meant to be a virtue that makes fundamental disagreement possible. And by fundamental disagreement, I mean those disagreements wherein we define ourselves and our opponents in the controversy, where sort of believing and belonging go together. And what worries me about the kind of duopoly is precisely the sense that, you know, once you know who you are, you know who your enemies are, and it's just a binary. It's pretty simple. And so, you know, I'm all for, I have a lot of time and affection for deliberative Democrats and democratic theory. But I think what I'm interested in is something more everyday and ethical, much along the lines that Zephyr was talking about. How do we get people to think of themselves as relating to other people, not necessarily through these identities? And and part and parcel of that then is the kind of, you know, politics as entertainment. Sort of, you know, we are turned into consumers of politics in the way that we've become consumers of reality television, including network reality television, on which our current president was very successful. So I think, that's where I'm coming from. And as an educator, I see it mostly about sort of how do I get my students to think about themselves.
Let me add one more thing. The public is actually telling us something, because the percent of people self-identifying as independents is rising, and the percent of undecideds as we came to the close of this election was at an unprecedented level. That is a rejection of whatever is going on right now, and it doesn't suggest that the two parties have a lock on this current structure.
Yeah, they want to change the channel.
Richard, way in the back.
Yeah, Rich Schifrin, Indiana. I hate to tell you how such a wonderful morning depresses me. A theme that I see going through many of the talks this morning is size. I think of Elinor Ostrom's work. Democracy seems to work pretty well with very small groups, and the larger the group, the worse things seem to get. And I'm wondering if you have any comments related to that.
Well, Jim has an obvious answer that he relayed. I mean, I can say on behalf of Madison that there was an upper bound going back to the founding period that Madison worried about. You know, whether it be from sea to shining sea, much less Alaska, was a problem.
Yeah, I'm using the Athenian insight as to how to adopt the small group, a random sample, to represent a large group. And it turns out you don't need a larger sample to represent a larger country or a larger population. We don't know if the Greeks understood that statistically, but their samples were perfectly fine. But then you've got the problem of the people who aren't deliberating, everybody else. So then you need a context where, for some reason, somebody, the media, the decision makers, or have to pay attention to what the people in the microcosm deliberate about. But we can do this for any size. And the media magnifies even small group things sometimes. So we need the media partnerships, we need the government partnerships, and the issues have to be prepared in a way and vetted so that people have some confidence that the competing sides and the evidence is appropriate, And that takes a lot of work. Otherwise, everybody will say it's fake news or whatever. So, I mean, that's the challenge.
Zephyr? And
Yeah,
then
I mean, just to bring some disagreement, I don't think any scale works at all in the same way. And I actually think this is one of the hardest and most important questions. And in our country, so in 2010, around Dodd-Frank, what the big banks wanted more than anything was preemption. Federal preemption, so states didn't have power to pass real usury laws, essentially. And you certainly see corporate power working far more effectively on the national level. And then we have our horrific ongoing history of ownership and then credit monopolies, keeping them suppressed, and slavery and Jim Crow, and grotesque treatment of other human beings in the South, which cuts against that. So I think that my strong instinct is towards devolution of power to the states for exactly the reasons you're talking about. And my strong hesitation has to do with the racism in our history. And I don't have an answer there, but I actually think that's a crux of one of our democratic questions.
This goes in cycles. We've had the federal government being the intervener to correct the problems in the states, and now, given who's in control of the federal government, we've got an interest in the states, but the states are a little bit more vulnerable to manipulation and corruption and penetration by organized interests, as we've seen in the spread of certain kinds of legislation. And we've got...
Jim, that's a very Madisonian position.
Yeah.
Nick was about to say something.
Yeah.
So I'd say if our democratic problems were really inevitable or insoluble, then I think we'd expect to see a lot of the same problems materializing in other advanced, complex Western democracies. But by and large, we don't. Many of the problems with American democracy, or at least American election law, are unique to our system and have largely been either solved or largely resolved in most of our peer countries. Gerrymandering, which I talked about, is simply not a problem anywhere else in the Western world, even where they use the same single-member district system that we do, because they don't have self-interested politicians doing the redistricting. Low voter participation, largely an American problem. Other countries, they have automatic voter registration, election day is on the weekend or it's a holiday. In some places, voting is compulsory, and participation is a lot higher. The dominance of the wealthy or the dominance of corporations in political life, well, Citizens United is an American decision. It doesn't have an analog in Canada or in Australia or in Britain or in continental Europe. And so, yes, clearly those aren't realms of perfectly equal influence over elections, but they don't have the same radical inegalitarianism that we do. So I think most of our problems are, the product of our own unique, errors and pathologies, and they can be fixed. They're not inevitable.
The spread of
Very
populism all over Eastern Europe, Western Europe, the vulnerability to the low approval ratings for institutions, democratic institutions, it's almost universal. It really is amazing. So on the details, I'm sure you're right, but the basic fundamental problem of the disconnection between the public and those who purport to govern them is spreading everywhere. And also the tendency of countries, look at what's happening in Hungary, look at what's happening in Turkey, the tendency of what my colleague Larry Diamond has called the democratic recession is a global recession, and we have the rise of what's been called competitive authoritarianism, where the forms of democracy are preserved, but the actual substance of democratic competition has been perverted. So I don't accept the rosy global picture, but I accept what you say about redistricting.
I think there's one last question from. There you go.
Is it Tyson or Pilgrim?
Yeah. Maybe it's Foster Farms.
Exactly.
This is David Maxey from Philadelphia. This is a question to Professor Stephanopoulos, going to the ability of the courts to enforce some of these democratic ideals. Suppose that the Wisconsin case results in a decision by the court to invalidate the gerrymandering, what is the next step? What is the decree? And maybe you'd be good enough to comment also on a parochial development here in Pennsylvania with our Supreme Court's recent decision, which is a reflection, by the way, of the change in the arguably partisan composition of the court to remap Pennsylvania.
Sure. So I can tell you, if we win in Wisconsin, my next academic article will be titled "Partisan Gerrymandering Remedies." What do you do if you win a case like this? Nobody really knows, because nobody's won a case like this, ever since the cause of action was created. My view is that once there's been a finding of a constitutional violation that includes intentional and effective discrimination, the remedy has to be to get rid of all of the vestiges of that discrimination. So, it would not satisfy me if Wisconsin comes back and says, look, this time we ignored party data, and if it happens that our new map is still going to elect 60% Republicans and 40% Democrats, well, you can't prove we had partisan intent. I would say that has not cleansed the taint of the original underlying violation. So I think that we have to have some real measure of balance or of fairness in a remedial map.
So
in that regard, let me just say the Pennsylvania process that you mentioned is a model, I think, because the Pennsylvania Supreme Court didn't just say we're going to ignore electoral data and just kind of see what happens. They enacted a remedial map that is almost perfectly fair on the efficiency gap and all these other metrics. So, if we go back to court on remedies, I plan to cite, over and over again the Pennsylvania example as an illustration of exactly how partisan gerrymandering remedies ought to operate.
So I'd like to thank all the panelists for their knowledge and enthusiasm.